It is so good to be here together, and I just want to second all those praises that we can worship together, at least for now, without fear of persecution or anything like that. During this pandemic situation, that is not the case for all of our brothers and sisters around the world who worship the Lord, and we are indeed privileged. And there's a song that's it's one of my favorites in the hymnal, but one of the verses says that we are blessed to be a blessing, and that is indeed why God blesses us, is so that we can be a blessing to others, and this blessing that we have is no different. So we just pray that He will use the privileges and opportunities that He's given us right now in whatever way He has in mind. But it's certainly a blessing to us this morning. Today is the day you're going to want your Bibles for the sermon, and if there's anyone in this room who has a Bible in this building but it's not in this room, I'm going to give you a moment to run and get it if you need to. So if you got a Bible in a locker or something like that, you're going to want it this morning. It'll be worth it to run and get it. While you do that, I'm just going to get a music stand here to put some of my papers on. It was a tremendous blessing to hear the kids play and sing this morning. March was a long time ago. In some ways it feels like yesterday. Things have gone so fast, but in other ways it was a long time ago. Praise the Lord to be together. We're going to be looking first in Deuteronomy. So as the others are returning, Deuteronomy chapter 29 is where we'll start. And we're actually going to spend quite a bit of time in that area of Deuteronomy this morning. Someday recently, I don't remember exactly when, if it was this past week or the week before, I happened to be reading in Deuteronomy 29 and 30, and I felt like the thoughts there that God was leading me to were ones that I should share here. So we're going to look pretty extensively at Deuteronomy 29 and 30. Deuteronomy 29, the chapter begins with this verse. Moses is speaking here. Basically, the whole book of Deuteronomy is Moses speaking to the children of Israel just before he dies. My sermon won't be quite that long, so we won't have 30 or more chapters today. But Moses' final speech was that long, and it was extremely significant. And in chapter 29 here, he says, "These are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he made with them in Horeb." So Horeb, of course, is Mount Sinai. We're aware of the covenant that God made with the children of Israel at Mount Sinai. But this says that he made kind of another covenant. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's really any different, but that he made a covenant with them here in the land of Moab, where Moses was giving this speech. And so, because chapter 29 begins with that, and interestingly, in the Hebrew Bible, chapter 29:1 is actually the last verse of chapter 28. And so, indicating that at least some folks think that that statement really is talking about what was said before, not what's about to be said after. And when you read the chapters, that makes sense. So we're going to actually back up, and we're going to look at Deuteronomy chapter 28 and see what this covenant is that's being talked about there in chapter 29. So we can kind of set the context for chapters 29 and 30. So Deuteronomy chapter 28. "Now it shall come to pass." We won't read every single verse, I don't think, of 28, but I'll let you know when we're going to skip some. "Now it shall come to pass, if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set you high above all nations on the earth." Now, just a reminder here, we know that the book of Exodus is where we get the story of the children of Israel at Mount Sinai and God presenting to them the Ten Commandments, and then immediately after that presenting the rest of the things he wanted to say to them through Moses because they were too afraid to hear it straight from him anymore. But in Deuteronomy, Moses repeats the Ten Commandments to the children of Israel. So when he says here, "all his commandments which I command you today," Moses had in fact that day repeated to them the Ten Commandments that God had given at Mount Sinai and a whole bunch of other things that God had instructed Moses to tell them. So he says, if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God to observe carefully all his commandments, which I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you because you obey the voice of the Lord your God. So now he lists these blessings that he's talking about. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the country. That pretty much covers everywhere. Blessed shall be the fruit of your body, the produce of your ground, and the increase of your herds, the increase of your cattle, and the offspring of your flocks. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed shall you be when you come in, and blessed shall you be when you go out. This is pretty comprehensive. Now, remember, this is an agrarian society, right? So growing food is how they get food and that kind of thing. So a lot of the references there to things like their cattle and the fruit of their ground and that kind of stuff, this would apply to basically everything that was their business transactions and all that kind of stuff, right? Okay, where are we? Verse 7. The Lord will cause your enemies who rise against you to be defeated before your face. They shall come out against you one way and flee before you 7 ways. So they might come to battle against you, but then they'll just take off in all directions because God is going to give you victory. The Lord will command the blessing on you in your storehouses and in all which you set your hand. He will bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Of course, they were just about to enter that promised land, and that's what this whole journey was about, right? They left Egypt, and they were headed to the land that God had promised way back before to Abraham, right, and to his descendants. And so again, the promise here to bless them in that land. The Lord will establish you a holy people to himself, just as he has sworn to you, if you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in his ways. Then all peoples of the earth shall see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they shall be afraid of you. Now, afraid of you can have different meanings. We know that the Bible talks about fearing God, right? But it also talks about fearing other things. And it's all one word. It's all the same word, fear. And some of their enemies would indeed be afraid of them. We know that when they entered the promised land, there were people that were terrified of this group that was coming and the God who was fighting for them, right? And probably a lot of those people had made some final decisions that put them in a situation where they ought to feel exactly that way about it, like terrified. Okay, but the fact of the matter is that fear also can refer to awe and respect and that kind of thing, right? And there were a lot of people like Rahab, for example, in Jericho, right? Rahab's fear of Israel was not a terror of them that they were going to kill her, right? It was an awe that drew her actually to it, and she became part of Israel. Right? In fact, she became part of the lineage of Jesus. So that fear, when it says they'll be afraid of you, that means more than one thing there. And God really had a preference for one particular kind of fear that the others would feel toward Israel. Right? He would love for all nations to fear in the awe and reverence and respect sense that draws them to become a part of these people who worship that God, the only true God. Right? And so that he says that they'll be afraid of you. All right, back to verse 11. And the Lord will grant you plenty of goods, in the fruit of your body, in the increase of your livestock, and in the produce of your ground, in the land of which the Lord swore to your fathers to give it you. The Lord will open to you his good treasure, the heavens, to give the rain to your land in its season, and to bless all the work of your hand. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. In other words, you're going to have the abundance, right, to where others can borrow from you. You're not going to have the need where you need to borrow from others. So he's telling them they're going to be blessed with abundance. And the Lord will make you the head and not the tail. You'll be the leader. You shall be above only and not be beneath, if you heed the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and be careful to observe them. So you shall not turn aside from any of the words which I command you this day, to the right or to the left, to go after other gods to serve them. Okay, now, we're not going to read all of the pieces of these chapters or whatever, but I read that whole section there on purpose because I wanted us to see all the blessings that God was telling them that would be theirs, right? If they would just give heed to what he was telling them, how he was directing them. If they would simply remember his commandments and keep them, right? Then he was telling them this was going to be the result, and it would be like this. So I have subtitles in the Bible I'm reading from. I took this from the New King James. And that whole section was called Blessings on Obedience. And then there's a next subtitle now that says Curses on Disobedience. So curses is just the opposite of blessings, right? And the next verse then starts with but. So he's been saying all these things about the blessings if you obey, if you're faithful, right? But he says, but it shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments and his statutes which I command you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the country. Does that sound familiar? Right? Because he said, blessed shall you be in the city, blessed shall you be in the country. I don't know why this is in a different order, but the third one in the other list, cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. That was the third one in the other list. The second one in the other list is next here. Cursed shall be the fruit of your body and the produce of your land and the increase of your cattle and the offspring of your flocks. So he runs through all those same things, and he says instead of those things being blessed, right, and prospering, they're going to be cursed and they're going to not prosper. Right? And so it goes through the list. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed shall you be when you go out. The Lord will send on you cursing, confusion, and rebuke in all that you set your hand to do, until you are destroyed and until you perish quickly because of the wickedness of your doings in which you have forsaken me. Now, remember, just like with the blessing part, this whole part started with an if. Right? So God's not saying, this is what I want to do to you or whatever. He's saying, if you do this, this is where it's going to go. This is how it's going to end up. Right? And so he's telling them these things. Now, after chapter 20, I'm going to skip 15 more verses of curses there. All right? And jump down to verse 36. Okay, verse 36. The Lord will bring you and the king whom you set over you to a nation which neither you nor your fathers have known, and there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone. The reason I singled out that one, because we're skipping a whole bunch of verses of curses here. We don't need to read all of those. It is interesting to me that there's way more verses of curses, but we're skipping a whole bunch, but I singled that one out because it said something extremely interesting. It said, the Lord will bring you and the king whom you set over you. The children of Israel didn't decide that they were going to have a king until the days of Samuel, until the end of the days of Samuel. It was later in Samuel's ministry as a judge, right, that the people decided that we need a king over us. Now, that doesn't mean they'd never thought of it before, okay, but at the same time, God is predicting here, if you're not faithful to me, one of the things you're going to do is set a king over you. I mean, he just said, if you're not faithful to me, I'm going to take you and the king that you're going to set over you and send you into another land, right? So God knows what's going on, and he's trying to warn the children of Israel. You would think that somebody, when the children of Israel are saying, we need a king, and maybe someone did, I don't know. But you would think somebody in the different committee meetings and the different whatever, when everybody's talking about this, right? And all the little gossip between the tents or whatever, don't you think we need a king? We need a king. And some of you are like, remember all the curses? Remember God mentioned that king we're going to set over us? Look, we're in the wrong half of that chapter. Right? We need to get in the other half of chapter 28, and there's no setting a king over us in that half. Right? I don't know. There may have been people that brought that kind of stuff up. We know how it went for Caleb and Joshua when they tried to reason with the people. So, I'm not sure exactly the background, but I thought it's very interesting that God pointed that out. Okay, we're going to skip 27 more verses of curses and jump down to verse 64. 64 is a high number. There's a lot of chapters in the Bible that don't have that many verses, but this particular one does. So, verse 64. After all these other curses that he mentioned, all the ways in which they're not going to be blessed, right, and these things will happen, he says, then the Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods, which neither you nor your fathers have known, wood and stone. The serving other God things is kind of a natural. If we forsake the living God, right, then we'll serve something else. And so that just makes sense, okay? But when he says to them, you're going to be scattered among all peoples, there's two really, really big things there, okay? One thing is, any people group that actually considers themselves a group, it's a bad thing to get scattered. Right? Because if you're really a group, you're together. And together is important. Right? And God's saying, you're not going to have together anymore. Right? If you forsake me and you leave me, you won't be able to keep together. Instead, you're going to end up scattered. You're going to be separated. Now, for the children of Israel, we know this played out in a very physical way. Right? In a very physical way. And the fact of the matter is that 10 out of the 12 tribes were scattered in a way that never got brought back. So when Israel came back from Babylon, right, 10 out of the 12 tribes didn't come back with that because they weren't scattered into Babylon. They were scattered into other nations before that, and that was never resolved. So he's warning them here about scattering, and scattering is a terrible thing. But the other piece here, which would have been very important to them, remember, the whole point of this journey that they're on is to go to the land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants, which was them. God had promised that land to them. They were going to the promised land, is what we call it, right? They're headed to the promised land, and God says, look, if you forsake me, you're not going to stay in that land, right? You're going to end up off in all kinds of other lands. Other lands where you no longer get to choose what is directing the government and the decisions and those kind of things in those lands. When you have your own land, right, then you and your group who are worshiping the one true God can decide how things are going to work in that land. And you can make things work in that land in a way that's very harmonious with the will and desires of that one true God. But when you're scattered into other lands, they who are worshiping gods of wood and stone, they're going to be deciding how things are going to work and how everything goes and what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, what happens to you if you do what you're not allowed to do, and etc. Right? And probably you've figured out that in a very physical sense, we don't live in the nation of Israel today. We're living in other lands. Right? And I grew up in the United States. All right, and the United States was never the nation of Israel. It was never a theocracy or anything like that. But when the United States started, it was very much founded on the concept of worshiping this true God and attempting to follow His will. And yes, separation of church and state was a fundamental thing there, and that's absolutely critical. But at the same time, the nation as a whole, the vast majority of the citizens and the leadership and everything, the whole idea was to run a land the way that God would have them run a land. That's no longer the case. And for people in the United States, they didn't have to get scattered to another country for that to happen. It just had to become another country, right? Over time. But you see what it's like when the land is not being run that way, and that's what God is telling them here. This is one of the biggest curses that's going to happen to you. This is one of the most terrible results that will come from choosing to be unfaithful, choosing to forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, right? One of the worst things that's going to happen is you're going to get scattered among other peoples and other nations instead of being in your own nation anymore. Right? And that's what he's telling us. And God, these curses or whatever, these are warnings. Right? God's saying, look, this is what I really don't want to happen to you, and I want you to really understand. So I gave you this, this short section of a chapter to tell you how beautiful it will be if you're faithful to me, right? If you trust me and you stick with me on what I'm calling you to, how beautiful it will be. But then I'm giving you this humongous, big, long thing to say, you really don't want to choose the other road. It leads to destruction. Right? It's terrible. You don't want to go there. And so God's trying to warn them. Verse, where are we? 65. And among those nations you shall find no rest. No rest. Nor shall the sole of your foot have a resting place. But there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing eyes, and anguish of soul. That does not sound comfortable. Your life shall hang in doubt before you. Talk about fear. Your life shall hang in doubt before you. You shall fear day and night and have no assurance of life. Look, listen to how bad it's going to be. In the morning you shall say, oh, that it were evening. They're going to wake up in the morning and be like, oh, I can't face another day. I wish it was evening. I was going to bed again. Not because they're tired and they want to sleep, although they probably are because they have no rest, but because the day is that terrible, right? But then look what he says. And in the evening you shall say, oh, that it were morning, because the night is terrifying. So which part of the day are they going to rest? They have no rest. They have no rest, day nor night. That's Revelation. Anyway, so because of the fear which terrifies your heart and because of the sight which your eyes see. Okay, we're going to skip the rest of chapter 28 there. But the covenant that Moses is talking about in 29 verse 1. He's not talking about the one at Mount Sinai, right? But it's directly related. It's basically the same concept. The covenant he's talking about is an agreement that if they obey the Lord, they'll be blessed, and if they forsake him, they'll experience evil. Right? It's an agreement. And the fact of the matter is, it's just a fact as well. So it'd be kind of dumb not to enter into an agreement that is just simply true. It's not like there's another option. Well, no, we could have it a different way, where we could be unfaithful and be blessed. It doesn't work that way. Right? So Moses is saying, look, here's this agreement, and in chapter 29, then he starts talking about it. These words that we just read, all this stuff, these are the words of the covenant which the Lord commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he made with them in Horeb. All right, and 29 verse 2. Now Moses called all Israel and said to them, You have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt. It's been 40 years at this point, right? Because they were unfaithful when they were supposed to enter the promised land, and then they ended up 40 years in the desert. During that 40 years, everybody who was of age, all right, and of age, I don't know exactly if that means like they were 12 or older or exactly what, but everybody who was of age at the time when they didn't enter the promised land, when they should have, right after the spies went out and all that stuff, died in the wilderness except for Caleb and Joshua. So everybody that Moses is talking to here, except Caleb and Joshua, number one, it's been 40 years since they came out of Egypt. And number two, they either weren't born yet when that happened, or they were fairly young, like very young when it happened. Right? Exactly how young, I don't know, because I don't know exactly what that age is, but they were fairly young or not born yet when it happened. And so Moses is reminding them, right? He's reminding them. And he's saying to them, look, what I'm reminding you of here is extremely real to you. Like the whole reason you're here is because of God's deliverance out of Egypt, because of all that. You've heard the stories. You've heard them so many times. You know them almost as if you experienced them. Have you ever had that experience? There's something, I think a lot of us have some things where like our parents and our older siblings have told us about this stuff that happened when we were like, 2 years old, right? And so we definitely have no memory of it ourselves, but we feel like we remember the whole thing. Like you don't feel like you just remember the story they told you. You feel like you actually remember it happening, even though you totally don't. But because you've heard the story so many times and so clearly, and all the nuances and everything, and you can feel all the feelings of it, and you can sense all the senses of being there and whatever, even though you weren't conscious of it then, to remember it now. The children of Israel, all the people he's talking to, have heard of God's deliverance out of Egypt so many times. And not in a way that just makes it dull and gone. It was serious and real. Like, this is why we're alive right now. This is why we're not slaves right now. This is why we have the hope that we're going to end up in that promised land. Right? And so he's saying, you've seen it. Right? You saw what God did. So, I lost my spot on my page. Let me find it again. You have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt. Some of them did see it, but they were kids at the time. To Pharaoh and to all his servants and all his land. The great trials which your eyes have seen, the signs and the great wonders. They saw signs and wonders in their journeys during that 40 years too, right? The signs and the wonders. Yet the Lord has not given you a heart to perceive and eyes to see and ears to hear to this very day. That verse is really, really jumps out at me, but it's not my topic today. And so I didn't study into it yet, but I'm interested to go back and see exactly why he said that. The Lord has not given you a heart to perceive and eyes to see and ears to hear. Okay, and I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on you. Your sandals have not worn out on your feet. You have not eaten bread, nor have you drunk wine or similar drink, and that you may know that I am the Lord your God. And when you come to this place, or when you came to this place, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, came out against us to battle, and we conquered them. We took their land and gave it as an inheritance to the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Therefore, keep the words of this covenant and do them, that you may prosper in all that you do. So Moses, as he said before, he's saying, if you keep the words that God is giving you, whatever, you will prosper, right, in all that you do. All of you stand today before the Lord your God. I'm going to skip to verse 12. That you may enter into covenant with the Lord your God, and into his oath, which the Lord your God makes with you today. That he may establish you today as a people for himself, that he may be God to you, just as he has spoken to you, and just as he has sworn to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, verse 14 is critical. It's very important for us. He says, I make this covenant and this oath not with you alone. So not just the people I'm talking to here, but with him who stands here with us today before the Lord our God, as well as with him who is not here with us today. This covenant is for us too. We weren't there when Moses spoke it back then, but he said specifically, it's not just for you that are listening to me right now, right? It's for others who were not here as well. Okay, and so Moses was pointing out there the fact that we today sitting here, right? As we read this in Deuteronomy, God is offering that same covenant to us, right? He's offering it to us as well and calling us to it and inviting us to it. So then parenthetically, For you know that we dwelt in the land of Egypt, and that we came through the nations which you passed by, and you saw their abominations and their idols which were among them, wood and stone and silver and gold. So when he's talking about having a covenant with the living God, he reminds them, you've seen all those other gods, right? As we were going through and whatever. You don't want that, right? We don't want that, and the results of that. So he says that it's in parentheses in the New King James, but he kind of mentions that on the way by. And then he says, so now it's back to the original sentence from verse 14. I make this covenant and this oath, right? Verse 18, so that there may not be among you man or woman or family or tribe whose heart turns away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of these nations. I'm telling you all this stuff that I'm telling you today. So there won't be anybody in Israel who would choose to go follow those gods of those other nations instead of following our God. Right? That's why I'm telling you this, is so that won't happen. And so it may not happen. This is verse 19 now. And also, so it may not happen that when someone, okay, that's going to be unfaithful, when he hears the words of this curse, that he blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall have peace, even though I follow the dictates of my heart. So Moses says, look, I'm telling you all this and reminding you of these things and all that so that nobody will choose to be unfaithful to God, and so that nobody would hear these curses and say, I'm going to be fine even though I'm going to follow my own way. So that nobody would be dumb enough to think that that would be true. That they could have peace, or in the New American Standard Bible, it says, I will be safe even though I follow the dictates of my own heart. So that nobody would think that they would actually be fine if they just follow their own way. Because we won't be fine if we just follow our own way. Right? And Moses is trying to make that really clear to them for their safety. Right? For their safety. Okay, jump to verse 20. Well, I guess we're just jumping over the last part of that, verse 19. The Lord would not spare him, for then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy would burn against that man, and every curse that's written in this book would settle on him. And the Lord would blot out his name from under heaven. And the Lord would separate him from all the tribes of Israel for adversity, according to all the curses of the covenant that are written in this book of the law. One of the things about reading in books like Deuteronomy, all right, is that God is really, really trying to get across to them how terrible it is to live in sin. He wants them to know how horrible sin is. And so when we read it, it almost sounds like, man, God's just like, he's really mean and nasty, and he wants them to know. He's threatening them like crazy. God's not threatening them. I mean, depending on exactly how we define the word threatening, he is. All right? But God's not like, look, I'm going to try to scare you into obedience. God actually told them how beautiful things are if they do follow his way. How wonderful it is. Right? But please understand that if they don't choose to follow his way, it's not just, oh, then you just don't get all these good things. No, actually, it's like really bad. Like choosing the way of sin it's hard to describe how bad. And God's kind of trying to describe it, and it sounds really bad. Right? And if, by the way, it sounds to you like, man, for those who don't follow it, God is really bad, you know what? In a way, that's true. The God that they see is really bad. When we choose not to trust and believe in God and who he really is, what we end up seeing is a God who looks like what Satan thinks he looks like. And Satan doesn't think God looks very nice. Right? And so it would to them, in fact, look that way. Like God is mean and nasty and all these kinds of things. And God's like, you know that I'm not. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. I did all these things, whatever. You know I'm the God who loves you and cares for you and saves you and provides for you and all these things. I'm the God who gives you life and that more abundantly. You know that that's the case. But if you choose that other way, you're not going to know it anymore. And you're going to think that I hate you. Right? And that I'm terrible to you. And that's what it sounds like here, sort of, the way that Moses is describing the way that it would be. Now, we're going to jump up to chapter 30. And chapter 30 is where it really hits. Okay? Chapter 30, now it shall come to pass, when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you. Well, that's kind of interesting. I thought it was an either-or thing. Like we're going to get the blessings, or we're going to get the curses. But that verse there just used the word and. When all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind, like you remember them, among all the nations where the Lord your God drives you. Oh, wait a minute. How are they going to get in all those other nations driven there by the Lord? That only happens if they choose the unfaithful route. Does God know what's going to happen here? God is warning them. Now listen, when God makes a warning like this, it's a prophecy, and God's prophecies in general, if not always, are conditional. Right? They're conditional. God does know what's going to happen, right? And that they're going to do that. But at the same time, it could be avoided if they chose to be faithful to him. They wouldn't end up scattered into those other nations and remembering about these things and whatever. If the prodigal son made some different choices, he could stay in his father's house and wouldn't have to remember what his father was like while he's lying in the pigsty, right? So God's not saying, this is what I'm going to make sure happens to you, right? But he does recognize this is what you're going to choose. And unless you guys make some choices, children of Israel, make some choices different from what, your history would indicate that you're going to do, right? Unless you make some choices different than that, you're going to end up thinking about these things in these other nations where you've been scattered to. All right? Because it's going to go down that road that we just went through for a whole big long chapter. And so God is recognizing that. But then it's really interesting that he said, when you've experienced the blessings and the curses. And we don't have time for a math lesson today, a logic lesson on if-then statements and how they work. All right? But when God says, if you're faithful to me, then you'll receive these blessings, that does not mean if you're not faithful, you won't receive any of them. Logically speaking, it doesn't say that. Okay? And again, I don't have time to unpack that or whatever, but just for today, just recognize that that's the truth. And God is saying here that really, even if they follow the wrong way, they're still going to receive some blessings from him. Why? Because he loves them. He loves them more than himself. So he's going to give them some blessings too. Will their overall picture be blessings? No. No. Right? Not if they choose that way, because that's not how it works if you choose that way. But God is still going to be trying to reach out to them with blessings and with curses, anything he can find to try to wake them up and help them to remember that God who was so good that they left. Right? So that they go back to him. So, kind of an interesting thing. But again, God predicts here, what's going to happen. So, he says, when these things come upon you and you call them to mind, you remember them, verse 2, and you return to the Lord your God and obey his voice, according to all that I command you today, you and your children, with all your heart, with all your soul, that the Lord thy God, your Lord your God, will bring you back from captivity. God is predicting ahead of time, you guys are going to do this. You're going to leave me. You're going to go through all these curses. I will bring you back. I will take you back. Right? If you just remember me, right, and choose to turn back to me, I'll take you back. I'll take you back to the promised land. It won't just be like, I'll be kind to you and leave you in those other places where you got scattered or whatever. I will bring you back to the promised land. You can come back and have the first section of Deuteronomy chapter 28. Even after you foolishly chose the second part of Deuteronomy chapter 28, right? If you'll just turn back to me with all your heart. Right? I'll bring you back to that. Because that's what I really want to do. It's what I really want to give you. So he says, I'll take you back. I'll bring you back from captivity and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where the Lord your God has scattered you. Okay, now, just before we go to the next verse, I don't think I have to make the application of this to us, do I? Right? So yes, this is the story of the children of Israel, which all those things that happened to them happened for examples, right? So that we could see them and we could learn from them, so that we could learn the spiritual things from the physical things that they went through. All right? And so for us, look, if we are unfaithful to God and we leave God, it's going to be bad for us. It's going to be bad for us. Not because God wants to be bad for us, right? Not because he wants to do evil toward us, but because, number one, the way of the transgressor is hard. Sin brings death and suffering and all those things, right? And number two, because God also will allow and bring some of those things to try to help us wake up and recognize, no, I don't want to be on this road. This is not a good road. If God lets us go down that broad road to destruction, and it's just fantastic and comfortable all the way as we're going, right? Then we're probably going to get to the end of that road, and the end of that road is death, and then it's done. Then it's too late, right? So along the way, of course, he even wants us to experience some hard things along the way. He wants us to see this way is not actually a good way, right? I want to turn on the other way while I still can. And so he calls them to that, and he's saying to us, look, if you have been walking on the other way, on the wrong way, right? God is calling to your heart. And he's saying, I will welcome you back on the way to life. I'll welcome you back on the good way, right? Anytime, turn to me with all your heart and I'll take you there. And you can have all the blessings. You can have that relationship with me that I so want with you. And that I described to you and told you how wonderful it was. You can have that. Anytime you can have it if you just turn back to me. Right? If you just choose it and turn back to me. Now, verse 4, I really, really loved verse 4. If any of you, or in some versions it says if any of yours, like any of your people or whatever, are driven out to the farthest parts under heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you. Look, I don't know where you're at this morning in your relationship with God. But I feel pretty confident that all of us know people in our lives, family members, friends, acquaintances, whatever it might be, that all of us know people that haven't just strayed from God some, but like they've gotten real distant from him. Like real far from him. All of us know people like that. And probably most of us, if not all of us, right, are praying for certain people in our lives that we know are just what would seem to be hopelessly lost, although we know nobody's hopelessly lost with God, right? But it would kind of seem that way, like they're just way far from him. And sometimes in my life, I recognize, I'm more distant from God. I'm more distant from God than I once was. Or I'm more distant from God than I should be. He's given me opportunity to be much closer to him than I am, or whatever. Okay, but we're talking now in verse 4 about people that are like way gone. Right? And he says, I'll bring them back too. I'll bring them back too. If you know anybody that's like rejecting God, right? Like outright rejecting them, acknowledging that they're rejecting him. If you know anybody that's just outright choosing the world over God, right? Verse 4 is for you and for them. And he says, the farthest parts under heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you. He'll gather them. From there he'll bring you. Then the Lord your God will bring you to the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. He will land, by the way. Land is representative of something. All right? And among other things, it's representative of a state of being. God is saying that you can actually be the way that I've promised you that you can be if you turn back to me. Right? In your heart, in your character, in your life, in your experiences, in that relationship with him. That whole thing, the land is all that. And the promised land is what God had in mind, and these other lands are the ones we end up scattered into. Right? And I did use the word we that time. And we end up scattered into these other lands, and God says, I'll bring you back to the experience that I described for you. The experience that was my will for you all along. Right? I'll bring you back to that. I'll bring you back to that. Verse 7, also the Lord your God will put all these curses on your enemies and on those who hate you, who persecuted you. And you will again obey the voice of the Lord to do all his commandments which I command you today. The Lord will make you abound in all the work of your hand. Here come the blessings again. In the fruit of your body, in the increase of your livestock, in the produce of your land for good. For the Lord will again rejoice over you for good, as he rejoiced over your fathers, if you obey the voice of the Lord your God, and keep his commandments and his statutes, which are written in this book of the law, and if you turn to the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. Okay, we've read a lot. I only have this much left from the Bible passage that I printed off, okay, just so you know. We're skipping some verses, and we're going to verse 15. I don't know how many. Maybe we just skipped one. But whatever it is, we're skipping up to verse 15. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. This is what Moses said to them. Look, all this stuff we've been talking about, basically what I've shown you today is a choice. life and good, or death and evil, in that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, his statutes, and his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land which you go to possess. It's interesting that he just said there, I've set before you these two options, right? And he says, when I command you to love the Lord your God and walk in his ways, what I'm doing is giving you those two options. Command and options don't sound like they go together, but that's what he just said. He said, I'm showing you life and good or death and evil when I command you to love the Lord your God, to keep his commandments. Right? Then I'm pointing out that option to you. Jump to verse 19. I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you. Now, against there doesn't mean what it sounds like. Okay, but witnesses standing before you. So the witnesses are standing here looking at you to witness this decision, this choice that you're going to make. Right? I call heaven and earth to witness today against you that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life. Choose life. Right? And I don't know what Moses' voice sounded like when he said it. I know his voice didn't sound like really old, like he was about to die or whatever. Moses never got to that point. Moses was young and strong at 120 years old, and he just laid down and died, right? Because God said, well, it's time to die, so he just laid down and died. So it wasn't that way. But I don't know whether when he said that, there was pleading in his voice or tears in his voice. I know that when God says to us, choose life, that he says it all kinds of different ways. Sometimes he says it to us very like, hey, come on, choose life. Right? And sometimes he says, please, choose life. Please. It all depends on the situation and the circumstances and how we need to hear it right then. Sometimes he shouts it really loud, and sometimes he whispers it to us in our ear. I don't know how Moses said it that day, but he said it. He said, choose life, right? That both you and your descendants may live. Please understand that when we don't choose life, it affects others besides just us, right? That you may love the Lord your God, that you may obey his voice, that you may cling to him, for he is your life. He is your life and the length of your days, and that you may dwell in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, to give them. All that stuff there that Moses was talking about was just one choice. One choice. Life or death. Life or death. And when you boil it down like that, you think, well, would I choose death? I mean, that seems really stupid, doesn't it? Like, if I could choose life or death, life or death. And ultimately, that's the only choice we really have. It's the only choice we really have. Those of you that were on the camp out a few weeks ago, remember that I told you that there's really only one conflict that we're in. We seem to get in all kinds of different conflicts, but there's really only one, the great controversy. That's it. All the other conflicts we're in are just little pieces of that playing out, right? We really only have one choice. We like to talk about freedom of choice, and God gives freedom of choice and whatever kind of thing, but we often don't stop and think about what we're really saying there. God doesn't give freedom of all choices. He gives one. Now, we're blessed to live in countries, whether it's Canada or the U.S. or a lot of the other countries that the students come from or whatever. We live in countries where we actually are afforded many choices. God never promised all those choices. And if your government in your nation promises to you a whole bunch of different choices that you have, trust me, you may not have those choices within the next year, month, whatever you want to say. Choices that I've had all my life have been taken away over just the last year, right? And there'll be many more that will be taken away. Now, they may not all be taken away. So when Jesus comes, there may still be certain choices that people are able to make in the nations that they're in or whatever, but none of those are promised. When we say that God guarantees you freedom of choice, we're talking about one choice and one choice only. He doesn't guarantee any others. Sometimes he lets us have them and sometimes he doesn't. But there is one choice he guarantees and nobody can take it away from you. You get to choose. Life or death. Life or death. Right? And if those words aren't big enough, if you need a bigger picture or whatever, read Deuteronomy again. Right? Read the rest of the whole Bible. Life or death, it's the one choice that we really have. Which one do we want? Which one do we want? Jesus made a couple really interesting statements about life and death. And they seem similar to me when I really think about them. In Matthew 16:25, this is a familiar verse, Jesus says, "For whosoever will save his life shall lose it. And whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it." right? And you've considered that verse before. You've heard it preached on or talked about in a Sabbath school class or whatever, right? But what he's saying is that if we try to keep a hold of our life for ourselves, we're going to end up with death instead, right? But on the other hand, if we let go of our selfish desires to hold on to our life, if we let go of that and give it to God, sacrifice it for Him, live it for Him, right? That instead we'll have actual life. We'll have actual life. That was Matthew 16:25. John 12:24 is later in Jesus' ministry, just a little later. So that one he spoke in the temple court to his disciples and some others that were around. But then later on, after the triumphal entry, when the Greeks come and say, we want to see Jesus, right? And Jesus is talking to them. He says this, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abides alone. But if it dies, it brings forth much fruit. And basically what he's saying is, if it tries to stay alive, right, then it'll just be dead. But if it dies, then it'll bring forth life. Seems like a paradox to us. But if we understand what Jesus is saying, the book Desire of Ages, commenting on John 12:24, that corn of wheat verse we just read, says, to give is to live. To give is to live. Now that short sentence right there is enough. Just hold that sentence. Okay, but the next sentence does say, the life that will be preserved is the life that is freely given in service to God and man. If we want to choose life, remember Moses said, I give you life and death, choose life. If we want to choose life, it's to give ourselves in service to God and man, rather than serving ourselves. And the same book, Desire of Ages, talking about Matthew 16:25, the other verse, says selfishness is death. Life is giving, serving. Selfishness is death. So the choice between life and death is a choice between living to serve others or living for self. Some other quick verses that talk about life and death. Matthew 7:14, enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction. That's death. Right? And there are many who go in by it. We can see that the way to death is easy and it's popular. Right? We'll have to be intentional if we want to avoid that. 1 Peter 5:8, be sober, self-controlled, by the way, is another definition there. Be vigilant or watchful. Because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. To be devoured is death. Right? So here we see that there's an enemy who really wants us to choose death. He can't make us die because that choice can't be taken from us. Right? He wants us, though, to choose death. He really wants us to. Right? Like a roaring lion going about, seeking who he can devour, who he can get to choose death. To resist him, we're going to need to be self-controlled, right? We called it sober in that verse. Self-controlled, meaning that we control our self-focused desires rather than our self controlling us. And we're going to need to be watchful, like we're going to need to be always paying attention, right? 1 Timothy 5:6. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. This is Paul talking to Timothy. He says she because he happens to be talking about widows, women at the time, all right? But it applies to anyone. She who lives in pleasure or indulgence is dead while she lives. When the Bible talks about life, it's not talking about this physical existence that we all kind of have right now. That's not what the Bible means by life. And just like when the Bible talks about death, it's not talking about when this physical existence comes to an end, right? You remember the little girl was dead, right? And Jesus said, she's not dead, she's sleeping. But they knew she was dead. The issue wasn't that Jesus didn't realize she actually had died and thought she was asleep. The issue was that Jesus was saying, no, that's not death. That's just sleep. That's just sleep. This girl totally still has the opportunity for life, right? And to prove it to you, I'll bring her back to the thing that you call life. But that isn't life. Life is what this girl really has. It's eternal and cannot be taken away from her, right? She's asleep right now. So when the Bible talks about life, it's not talking about that physical existence thing. It's something deeper, something spiritual, something eternal. When Moses says choose life, sometimes to choose life means we choose to die physically. Right? All the martyrs, they chose life by choosing what we call death, which isn't really death. And what they got was life, right? Which is eternal and cannot be taken from them. And Jesus is just waiting for the opportunity for them to experience it with him, right? Which will come really soon. God is really concerned about our salvation. Like he's really worried about us making this choice. Worried's not the right word. I typed that and I changed it. But he's really concerned, right, about us choosing life. In Micah 2:10, he says, "Arise and depart, for this is not your rest. Because it's polluted, it will destroy you with a sore destruction." So just like Moses pled, choose life, God is pleading, don't stay where you're at. That's not life, right? That's death. Don't stay there. Come choose life. Some verses that tell us more about life. Of course, narrow is the gate, Matthew 7:14 again, and difficult is the way which leads to life. There are few who find it. If we want life, we're going to have to be intentional about it. We're going to have to put forth effort for it. We're going to have to stick with it even when we get tired. And there's going to be a lot of people who are not going that way with us. It won't be the popular way. Doesn't mean we shouldn't invite them and try to get everybody we possibly can to go that way, but there's going to be a lot of people not going that way and not happy about the fact that we are. Right? Proverbs 3:1-2. "My son, don't forget my law. For length of days and long life and peace it'll give you," God's law. Proverbs 4:13. "Take fast hold of instruction and don't let her go, for she is thy life." If we want to choose life, we need to welcome instruction and not resist it. Proverbs 14:27. "The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, to depart from the snares of death." The fear of the Lord, by the way, as much as anything else, it's being conscious of him as we live our lives. It's remembering that he's with you. It's talking to him and listening to the voice of his Spirit as he speaks to you. Then we'll be really living. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. 1 Peter 3:10, "He who would love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit." Peter makes an interesting little point here, that if we want to enjoy life, if we want to have life, we need to learn to refrain our tongue from evil. In other words, we shouldn't talk about bad things. Like that's just what that means, right? And remember, evil doesn't just include wickedness. It does include that, but not only that. We certainly shouldn't talk about that, but it includes anything negative, anything bad, right? So he's also pointing out to us that we shouldn't complain. Now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't ever point out an actual concern, actual problem so it can be fixed or whatever. But the complaining attitude, the complaining mindset, that's not good for us. That's not choosing life. If we want to enjoy life, it says that we should avoid that. He also says that we shouldn't be deceitful in what we say, right? Don't let his tongue utter deceit. Have you ever spoken in a way that was intended to mislead someone? One of your peers maybe a parent, maybe a dean, right? How about in a way that was intended to manipulate them without them knowing? That's also deceit. So you may not be saying anything untrue, but if you're trying to lead someone and move them in a certain direction without them knowing, right, bypassing their choice to do it, you're deceiving them, right? I shouldn't say you there, we, right? So if we want to love life and see good days, then we should be avoiding that. Now, in closing, here's the most important verse about life. I'm going to let you actually turn to this one. I know we went quickly through some of those others. 1 John chapter 5. 1 John 5, verse 12. And you could probably find some other verses that we could also say are the most important verse about life, all right? So I'm not trying to make an argument there. 1 John 5, verse 12. He who has the Son has life. And he who has not the Son of God does not have life. He who has the Son has life. Remember when it said in Deuteronomy 30, verse 20, He is your life? Oh, the He that Moses was talking about in Deuteronomy was Jesus. Right? Jesus was that rock that went before them. Jesus was the Lord, the living God of Israel. And is. He is your life. That's what John's saying too. To choose life means to choose Jesus. And to choose Jesus means to choose life. They're the same thing. They're the same thing. There's another well-known verse that talks about the choice. You don't have to turn here. You know this one, probably by heart. It's in Joshua chapter 24, right? And Joshua said, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. We will serve the Lord. Remember how the Desire of Ages said that living is serving God and serving others? Right? Joshua understood that too, but the fact is, everyone lives to serve. Everyone lives to serve. It's just a question of whether we live to serve God and serve others all day, every day, or whether we'll live to serve ourselves and ultimately then to serve Satan. It's serving either way. We close again with Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 19 and 20. I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life. Choose life, that both you and your descendants may live, that you may love the Lord your God, that you may obey his voice, that you may cling to him, for he is your life and the length of your days, and that you may dwell in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them very soon. Very soon, he's taking us over the border into that promised land. We can experience the promised land here and all the other aspects of it, but the physical aspect of it very soon. Right? We're going home, and it is home for all those who choose life, who choose Jesus. Our closing hymn is I'd Rather Have Jesus. It's the option. It's the one we all want.